Hi everyone, I hope this finds you well. In this lesson we're going to be talking about synthesizer polyphony. So in doing so we're going to talk about paraphony first, which is kind of like an incomplete or fake version of polyphony that we can get on some synthesizers. We'll talk about Tom Oberheim and the OBX. We'll spend some time with the Prophet 5 synthesizer and talk about voice allocation and how voice allocation works. And then talk about the listening assignments I gave you, which are related to the discussion of the Prophet 5. Then we'll talk about how to do polyphony in VCV Rack. And I'm going to just give a very brief overview of that. And for the technical and practical demonstration things, I'm just going to refer you to an Omri Cohen video. So this video on my end will be pretty short. I'll just give a quick overview of the historical things, and you guys can look at the YouTube tutorial for how to do this in VCV Rack. So let's start by talking about paraphony. Paraphony is a feature of some synthesizers in which different oscillators can produce different pitches. So we could do this on the MS-20. We could tune VCO1 to one pitch, tune VCO2 to another pitch, and then effectively we have an interval. We can play, whenever we press a key on the keyboard, we can get two different pitches sounding simultaneously. And we can do this in VCV Rack as well. So I've got a patch there on the slide that I've set up where I've got two different VCOs producing two different pitches. You can see one is tuned relatively low, the other one is tuned a little bit higher. And those two signals are merging in that U-mix module and then moving through the same VCF and the same VCA. So this is a lot like the kind of setup we had on the MS-20. And so you listen whenever I play these different pitches, they're tied together. So every time I take my finger off the keyboard and press them down again, I'm hearing both tied together. I can't play one and then play the other. And in fact, because of the way that they're tied together, it's even hard to differentiate them until I maybe detune one of them, and then your ear can see, oh, here's a high pitch and there's a low pitch. And if I were to play one note on the keyboard and then play a higher note, they're both just going to switch. They're both going to get sent that same volts per octave input, switch to the higher note, and that change will happen within the same envelope. So paraphony is kind of interesting. If you're working with a synthesizer that has three VCOs, three oscillators, you can actually use it to produce chords. So you could tune every oscillator to a pitch in a major or minor triad, and then you can move around the keyboard playing a single note and then producing chords. So paraphony is kind of handy. It allows intervals and chords to be played, but these voices cannot move independently. So it's not real polyphony. Polyphony meaning multiple sounds, but in generally, polyphony in Western music doesn't just mean more than one sound. It means more than one sound that is able to move fully independently of one another. So where one voice might sing a melody, arrive at a high note, and hold that note for a long time, and maybe underneath that there's a bass line that keeps moving even while that high note is being held. So these voices are able to move totally independently of each other. And we can't do that with a paraphonic synthesizer like an MS-20. So monophonic synthesizers, and paraphony were really the only options available on analog synthesizers throughout the 60s and most of the 1970s. However, towards the end of the 1970s, we did start to get the first actually polyphonic synthesizers. And one of the engineers that helped in the development of that was Tom Oberheim. So Oberheim was an engineer. He had some digital programming chops, and he was able to create some digital sequencers that could be added to some monophonic synths like the ARP 2600 or the Mini Moog that was able to use their paraphonic features to produce multiple pitches at the same time. So he later continued on this path, started his own company, and released the Oberheim polyphonic synthesizer, which, depending on which model you got, could play 2 or 4 voice chords. Now, around the same time he was working on his polyphonic synthesizers, another company called EMU was developing a polyphonic keyboard. And this was a keyboard that would actually respond to polyphonic input. So rather than just listening for which note was played, and then whenever a new key was depressed, either ignoring it or switching to that new pitch, the polyphonic keyboard would actually keep track of every individual key. And so whenever a key was depressed, the polyphonic keyboard would keep track of the volts per octave voltage from that key and then also the gate coming from that key. So you could play different keys at different times, and those keys would send different volts per octave voltages, and they would also start different gates. So it became a fully polyphonic keyboard that was able to send polyphonic information. So in collaborating with EMU, Oberheim was able to create the OBX, which was a polyphonic synthesizer which, depending on which model you got, could play 4, 6, or 8 voice polyphony. And this was a favorite synthesizer of Prince. So if you think back to the Prince examples, like 1999 that we listened to early in the semester, this is the synthesizer that he was using to produce those songs. Now, the OBX was an important polyphonic synthesizer, but it was released a year after the Prophet 5. It was actually released to compete with the Prophet 5. And the Prophet 5 is arguably a more historically important synthesizer. So the Prophet 5 was manufactured by a company called Sequential Circuits in the late 70s through the mid 80s. It was co-designed by a synthesizer engineer named Dave Smith. Dave Smith was also known as being the co-creator of MIDI. So he was one of the ones that decided, hey, a universal protocol where we could send performance data between synthesizers of all different brands and between synthesizers and computers would be really useful. So he was the one that kind of spearheaded that project. So the Prophet 5 was the first fully programmable synthesizer. And what that means is it could save and recall patches. So if you remember from working on the MS-20, you might set up a patch that you really like, everything sounds really good, and you have to either write down the settings on a patching diagram or take a picture with your phone or something because the MS-20 can't save and remember that patch. So if you change some parameters and then you want that patch you had a second ago back, you have to either remember and move all the knobs and get it back there. But on the Prophet 5, you could actually set up a patch that you liked and then hit the save button, and that would save a patch, and then you could make some changes but then recall that patch later. And this was the first synthesizer that allowed you to do that with every parameter. It's also the first instrument with an embedded microprocessor, and we'll talk about what that microprocessor did here in just a second. But the fact that it had a microprocessor is really important. It's got effectively a little computer built into it. So it's still an analog synthesizer. It's not a digital synthesizer by any means. It's still using voltage-controlled components in the oscillators and the filters and everything. But you can think of it as an analog synthesizer that's controlled by a computer. And even that's maybe overstating it. It was more like an analog synthesizer that had a couple different functions and features controlled by a small computer, by a microprocessor. So let's talk about polyphony on the Prophet 5. So the Prophet 5 was called the Prophet 5 because it could play 5-voice polyphony. So the setup was a lot like on the MS-20. On the MS-20, we had 2 oscillators that moved through a VCF and a VCA. Actually, on the MS-20, we had 2 VCFs, but we'll ignore that for now. So there are 5 voices on the Prophet 5, and each voice had 2 VCOs, 1 VCF, and 1 VCA. So each voice is equipped essentially like the MS-20. You've got 2 different oscillators you could tune to different pitches or tune them to different octaves or whatever, and then together, the signal from those 2 oscillators is going to move through its own VCF and its own VCA. So you have 10 oscillators total, 5 filters, and 5 VCAs, which is already a lot more than you have with most small all-in-one synthesizers. The thing is, on the actual control panel of the synthesizer, you didn't see all the controls for 10 oscillators or 10 VCFs or 10 VCAs. You only saw the controls for 2 VCOs, 1 VCF, and 1 VCA. And basically the controls that you saw would change the parameters for all the VCFs, all the VCAs, and all the oscillators. However, having those independent VCFs and VCAs would allow actual real-life polyphony to happen. And the fact that each of these pairs of oscillators was moving through its own amplifier in particular meant that every time you played a note on the keyboard, that would start a gate that went to the envelope generator, and that would give that note its own envelope. And then if you played a second note, that note would start, and it would have the same envelope settings, but the envelope would be able to start at a different time. So you could play one note and hold it, and then play the other. And their envelopes are going to start at different times and overlap and things like that. And the fact that they all have their own VCF is important too, because if you have your VCA shaping your VCF, where you play a note and maybe the filter opens gradually during the attack and closes during the release, you can have that fade in, fade out start for one note, and then have the timbre gradually change on the second note as you play the second note, and then the filter shapes that. And so you have these different amplitude and filter envelopes overlapping with every key that you depress. Now, you could still only play 5 notes at a time, and the way that the synthesizer kept track of this was through a process called voice allocation. And voice allocation is important because we're going to be doing the same thing when we're working in VCV Rack. So the way voice allocation worked is when a note is played on the keyboard, the microprocessor would scan the different voices to see which voice is not currently sounding, is not already tied up playing a note. And when it finds an empty one, it would send both the volts per octave voltage from whichever key you play, and then also the gate that says that you've started to depress a key. It's going to send that to that voice. So let's say there are no keys depressed on the synthesizer. When you press the first key, the microprocessors are going to scan and says, oh, all the voices are available. So it'll send the volts per octave and the gate to the first voice. And then when you add a second key, it'll send that to the second voice. Third key will go to the third voice. Let's say you're holding a 3-note chord and you let go of the second note, and then you play a 4th note. Well, the microprocessor will scan and see like, oh, well, voices 1 and 3 are used, but they let go of voice number 2, so we can send this new note to voice number 2. So basically the computer is constantly scanning, looking for available voices, and then sending any new key to those voices. Now, because the Prophet could only play up to 5 notes at a time, if you added a 6th pitch, if you held down 5 notes with one hand and then you took your other hand and played the 6th key, what's going to happen is the microprocessor would replace one of the other notes with this new note, usually the oldest one, the one that had been sustaining the longest. So the microprocessor would scan, say, okay, I've got a new note, I've got a 6th note, I don't have any voices left, so hey, voice number 1, you've been holding that note long enough, it's this new guy's turn. And then whatever note was being held on voice number 1 would be replaced with the new 6th note. So the Prophet 5 was one of these synthesizers that's really historically significant, both for introducing polyphony, but also for its use in certain pieces in popular media. So the Prophet 5 in particular was widely used throughout the 1980s to record film scores by composers such as John Carpenter. So John Carpenter is known for both directing and composing the scores to a lot of successful films in the 1980s, particularly horror films like The Fog, Christine, The Thing, Escape from New York, Halloween, things like that. And he used a number of now vintage synthesizers in his work, but the Prophet 5 always played a pretty strong role in his music. And so one of the pieces I've given you guys to listen to is the theme from The Fog. I'm not going to play an excerpt here in the lesson because I don't want YouTube to flag this for copyright reasons, but go ahead and take a look at that on Blackboard. What's nice about the theme from The Fog is you get a nice A-B between an actual acoustic piano and the Prophet synthesizer. So there's this melody that takes turns being played on the piano, and then you hear this echo or reflection played on the Prophet 5. Then you hear it on the piano again, and then on the Prophet. So you get this kind of movement back and forth. This John Carpenter style has kind of had a resurgence in recent years, particularly with regard to the Stranger Things soundtrack. So Kyle Dixon and Michael Stein, the composers who've worked on the score to Stranger Things, they use a number of vintage synthesizers in their work, including the Prophet 5. And so I've given you guys the Stranger Things theme to listen to, and the most recognizable factors in that theme, including the opening chords and the opening arpeggio, those are played on the Prophet 5. In addition, in the additional resources on Blackboard, I've given you a recording of the Song Exploder podcast in which the two Stranger Things composers talk about their work on that theme, some of the synthesizers they use, and their approach to the composition as a whole, which is just generally interesting and also maybe helpful for you as you think about composing more large-scale synthesizer projects, which is something you'll have to do for our final project, which will be coming up here in a couple weeks. So the Prophet 5 was succeeded by a couple different models. The Prophet 10 had 10 voices. The Prophet 600 added MIDI capability. Sequential Circuits itself shut down in the late 1980s, but Dave Smith started his own company called Dave Smith Instruments that in 2007 released an instrument called the Prophet 08. And the only reason I mention all this is because if we were still on campus, we would have access to Prophet 08s. We have several in the Rockwell lab and one upstairs in the DME lab. So next time you're able to get on campus and start working in the labs again, I encourage you guys to take a look at the Prophet 08s. If you need help getting set up doing that, just shoot me an email and let me know you're looking at working with those, and I'll do my best to help you out. And if you're interested in playing in the digital music ensemble, you'll have access to a Prophet 08 in that ensemble as well. So now we're going to transition and start talking about Polyphony and VCV Rack. As I said, I'm going to let the Omri Cohen tutorial be your primary guide through how to do this. I'll just give a couple introductory comments here. Rack introduced polyphonic cables in version 1.0, which was released fairly recently, just in June of last year. It introduces Prophet-style polyphony using voice allocation in a Eurorack-esque environment, which is kind of interesting because in an actual hardware Eurorack environment, you can't actually do polyphony in this way. There are different modules, like the one I've pictured on the slide, which is made by Dupfer, which has 4 VCOs in a single module, each with their own input and output. So there are modules designed to equip somebody who wants to do polyphony, but in the actual sense of voice allocation and using polyphonic cables to send multiple signals from one polyphonic module to another, that's something we can only really do in the digital Eurorack world in VCV Rack, but it's not something really available to people who work with hardware Eurorack modules. So the nice thing about doing polyphony in VCV Rack is it can reduce the number of modules needed. So if you wanted to set up a 4-voice polyphonic oscillator before polyphonic cables, you would have to have 4 VCOs, 4 VCFs, 4 VCAs, etc. But now you could do that with 1/4 of the number of modules. And in so doing, it doesn't just free up your rack space, but it also frees up your computer's memory. It leads to less CPU consumption. A couple things to look for in the Omri Cohen video. It's in general super elegant, very, very helpful. He uses mostly modules that we're already familiar with. So you'll see some modules that we looked at even in relatively recent lessons, like the gate sequencer and impromptus clocked and things like that. He also is able to show you working with a real MIDI keyboard, which is handy. He'll actually make a real arpeggiator in the video, unlike the one that we made a couple weeks ago, which just used sequencers and quantizers and didn't actually function like a real arpeggiator. He'll show you how to make one that responds the way a real arpeggiator does. A couple things I wanted to give you guys a heads up about, though. This is an older video of his. That's before he actually started using the color-coded patch chords. So if you're like me and you're now quite used to following patches by looking at the color-coded system of yellow for volts per octave, blue for gates, etc., this patch might feel a little confusing or a little noisy at first, so just know that he's not doing that. He's just kind of drawing the patch chords quickly. He uses a lot of modules that we're familiar with. He uses some that we're not familiar with, but towards the end, he uses some modules from Geodesics. And Geodesics makes these modules, which are really powerful. They're really useful. They look really cool, but in looking really cool, they very often don't have any of the labeling that we're used to seeing from other modules. So at the end, when he starts pulling out these Geodesics modules, it might be a little bit confusing because he'll be drawing patch chords from jacks that are not labeled, and it can be a little confusing. But I think he's pretty good at explaining what he's doing as he's doing it. And if you want to learn more about these Geodesics modules, you could subscribe to them in the VCV Rack library and then pull up their manuals. The first 2/3 of the video, I think, are extremely useful. Towards the end, things are still really cool. He's showing some really interesting stuff. It does get a little bit advanced, and if things get a little bit confusing, just do your best to follow. I've added some slides here that kind of lay out some of the main points that he goes through in his video, so you have that for reference. And if you have questions about anything that he covers, especially towards the end when things get a little more advanced, just let me know and I'll be happy to give you some additional details. All right, so that's where I'll stop for now. So today we talked about synthesizer polyphony, we talked about Paraphony, the Oberheim and Prophet 5, how voice allocation works. And then in the Omri Cohen video, you're going to look at how polyphony works in VCV Rack. He'll talk about polyphonic patch chords, the different polyphonic modes of voice allocation, which modules are polyphonic, and some different ways of working with polyphony in VCV Rack. So next week, we'll start looking at some different types of synthesis other than just doing subtractive or West Coast synthesis. So that'll be something to look forward to. Other than that, have a good weekend.